And this is PIN518, English literature. How are you all doing?
So far, so good.
So far, so good. The beginning of the day, the dawn.
Yeah.
How early have you started the day?
Today at 6:30 in the morning.
6:30 in the morning.
Yeah.
Wow. It's really, really early.
Yeah.
How about the rest of you? Have you just started the day, or do you have a good night? Good night's sleep?
Yeah, I just started the day.
All right. And Belen, you were saying?
Hmm?
You were saying?
So what?
Carla just started the day.
Yes.
And Belen, how about you?
I started the day at 6:30 in the morning.
6:30 in the morning.
Yeah.
And does anyone have issues with the connection? Issues that would, have some impact on your performance in class, in the sessions? Can you log in? Can you connect for every session? You don't have any problems, particularly with, we have had some issues. Sometimes I have frozen, but other than that, can you hear? Can you participate? In general, what's your perception or evaluation of the system? Virtual classes in general. Chen, chen, chen.
Well, in my case, sometimes it's not working well, but I think that maybe it's my internet because my brother is also in classes, and my mom is working here at home, so I think that maybe it's my internet the problem.
So you're all using the same internet connection?
Yeah.
Okay. That might be. That might be. Yeah, that could be also the thing is that several people using the same internet connection. Sometimes I don't know, children watching a movie and people with working from homes. Exactly. How about the rest of you? Do you have your own perceptions about this system?
Hello? Oh, sorry.
Hello.
Go ahead, Kata. Thank you. I don't know if my case is that my microphone doesn't work all the times in Teams. I don't know why. Maybe it's for something similar to Carla. That here are other people that are working on the with the same line, with the same internet connection.
Right, right. So that might be related to the functioning of your microphone. Yeah, that could be. That could be.
Yeah, maybe. Or the internet connection, I don't know.
Exactly. For the rest of you, it works pretty well, or you have your own issues with the system. Maybe it's not the technological side of it, but the way to get used to having sessions without meeting with people face to face, or maybe you miss some aspects of the interaction with your classmates. What's your perception? I think Daniela, you were going to make a contribution, right?
Yes. Yeah, I was about to say that sometimes I have trouble with the internet connection because my bedroom is placed like at the front of my house, and the connection doesn't work that well in this place. But if I go upstairs, I mean downstairs, I get very I can't concentrate that well because my parents are always there, entering, using the living room, or making phone calls because he's he does that for a living. He needs to talk with people, whatever. And I tend to share my own internet. I mean, from my phone. I share with the computer, and sometimes that works perfectly, but some others the connection fails, and I get very frustrated because when I cannot access to the sessions, I get like nervous, and it is like, okay, I don't want to go anymore. And on the other hand, it has been hard for me because I cannot concentrate that easily, and the fact of, I don't know, interacting each other, or attending the sessions online, it's a factor that doesn't contribute my learning experience. It doesn't work in a great way for me. It's been really, really hard. So I have to, I don't know, keep focus and try really, really hard. And that's my case, at least.
Thank you, Daniela. Daniela referred to very interesting points. For instance, the sharing of spaces in the same house. People were having to deal with virtual interaction with other people, working, studying, and having to share the same areas. I mean, you have to organize yourself so you can be in a specific room, and sometimes being there implies that someone else has to leave the room, particularly when some of you might be sharing the same, for example, same bedroom with a brother, a sister, or any other member of the family, or maybe you need to move to a different area. For example, myself, I had to move to a different area of the house, so I don't, because I don't want my daughter to be awake not until, I don't know, 9 o'clock in the morning. So I have to make some changes to organize my life and adapt to this situation. And I think that's everyone's situation, and it's a challenge. I think it's a test for everyone, and then. I tend to think that we're going to become more resilient in the end, and our abilities to adapt to new situations might improve, or else we're going to end up very stressed and frustrated at the attempts that are not being successful when we're trying to deal with studying and interacting using platforms, right, and other virtual vehicles. Anyone else would like to share his or her own experience with, virtual learning?
Me?
Okay, go on.
Apart from the problems that we have covered so far, I would add that for me, personally, it's like the most difficult part is that we are working with the computer the whole day. So we are in classes, but after classes, we have to deal with the homeworks, and we are still working on the computers. For instance, in my case, I don't have resources to print at home. So I have to read papers in the computer. So that is like a hard part for me because it's tiring at the end of the day.
I totally I agree with what you're saying, Romina. I've got the same issue here with the printer, and it's been complex to deal with my daughter's homework sent from school. So yeah, I have I had to do some tricks so to comply with all the assignments. So I totally agree with you. That's been an issue. Particularly when you have a preference for paper, or sometimes you really enjoy holding a book, and then you know, go to library, get a book, you borrow a book, and then you have it in your hands for a week or two, or for a couple of days, and there's not, I mean, that is not the option now. I'm not sure if the library is open. I haven't been to university. But yes, I agree with Amina that we have to read online, and it's a different taste, and it's also tiring. Exactly, exactly. I totally agree with Romina that it's not the same when you're reading from a piece of paper. Um, Anybody else? No? Yes? All right. All right then. Today we were going to talk about a little bit about the Last of the Mohicans. The Last of the Mohicans, in general terms, as I mentioned last session, in general terms means that you know, we could talk a bit about story. We're going to talk about specifically what is the I would say historical background for the story. This is a scene from the movie. The actor is Daniel Day-Lewis, a very famous and quite good actor that I'm very keen of, because he's performed several interesting characters in different movies. Daniel Day-Lewis, and anyway, um, the story of the Last of the Mohicans. Personally, it's not one of my favorite ones. Particularly, you know, we have this main character called Nati Bampo, or Hawkeye, because you know, people had real names, but also Indian names, or names given by natives, usually according to the person's skills. So if someone was a fast runner, would receive a name accordingly, or a quite brave warrior, or someone who was very skillful at killing an animal from a long distance, or yeah, I don't know, was very good at jumping from a cliff or from a tall tree. So people would receive names according to their skills, and also talents. And I would say any of these experiences that marked them in their relationship with nature, particularly with nature. Um, so we see in this novel, this is a part of a series of tales, right? And in the story, we see these Hawkeye and Uncas and Chingachgook, right, that are transporting or are taking care of two ladies, right, Cora and her sister, who go from one place to the other during the French and Indian War. That's my my concern, my interest here. During the French and Indian War, which is a chapter of the second 100 years war, a war between Britain and France, right? That's very important to remember. So these two important empires were trying to gobble up, were trying to conquer as much as possible, right? As much land or territories as possible. And they were in United States, right? England on the west coast, and France was coming from the north, from Canada, right? So remember that at this time, at this period of history, of human history, empires were trying to conquer as many and have as many colonies as possible because they wanted their resources, their natural resources, to continue growing, right? They wanted their woods, right? They wanted any mineral resources that they had, etc., etc. So it's very important to understand that greed for territory, so that we try to understand why they come or they engage in a war, right? So they meet in the Ohio River Valley, sorry, and there's the break point. They meet there in a battle, and because they try to get United States was trying to go west, right? Because the colonists needed more resources. So there was this huge country, and they really wanted to go westwards in what's called the westward expansion. So they were trying to move they were trying to move this frontier. The frontier was an imaginary line, right? There was not like a geographical feature, even though the Appalachians mountains were sort of a geographical feature that divided what was considered to be the the west side where civilization was, right? And I'm sorry, yes, the east side and the west, right, where all the Indian tribes and all the savages, between quotation marks, were. So this frontier, imaginary frontier, right, was moving towards the left, okay? And the idea of moving this frontier was actually getting more resources, because the number of inhabitants, the number of colonists was growing, and the number of colonists themselves was also growing. So more people, more resources are needed, and more territories, because they need, at this point of history, the society was based on agriculture, right? So in an agriculture-based society, you need more land to farm. And France was coming from the north, from Canada, and they wanted to acquire more territories. So they really wanted to go south. Okay, and remember that at the same time, Spain was also an empire that was also trying to get as much land as possible, and they were also moving from the south, right? If you have seen, or if you remember, in the states of Florida and states of New Mexico, in the south of United States, there's a lot of presence from Spain, right? I mean, Spain and also Mexico, but we're talking now about specifically Britain, France, and Mexico. So in this historical setting, right, in the French and Indian War, or as it was called in Europe, the 7 Years' War. Okay, it's also the same. We have this very interesting concepts of frontier, okay, frontier, westward expansion, and the manifest destiny. And in connection to the last concept, the manifest destiny was the idea that the white man received this commission, this request, this power from God to expand, to colonize other territories, and even to take religion as a weapon to transmit or convey the message of God to the rest of the people, particularly to Indian tribes. Okay, so in this specific lesson, the Mohicans, we meet or we see this, as we can read here, two civilizations: the white man civilization and the natives civilization. I didn't want to say Native Americans because that's a concept that sometimes is not welcomed in the native societies. Some of them do not consider themselves Native Americans, but only natives, right? And Indians is also a name that it's frowned upon by some societies or native communities. So let's call them just natives, all right? And this two civilizations collapse, but even in periods of war, we can see that, for example, the British sought allies, and also the French ones. So the French army or the French leaders put their knowledge and contact different tribe leaders. So they allied with different tribes. The same with the British. Okay, and in this novel, in The Last of the Mohicans, we learned that actually it's very important that the ways in which they fought in a war did not work for the Europeans as well as for the native tribes, because the territory was different. The Europeans were used to fight in the open. The two armies met in a plain territory with, all the armies, cannons, and all their weaponry, and they fought each other in plain sight. One army was looking at the other, right? And then they play this sort of martial chess. So they would move specific regiments or specific companies left, right, just like if they were playing a chess. Not everyone, but just the general, right? And but in this case, the type of fight was between woods and between and hiding between rocks, and with a big surprise factor present in all the different battles. So Europeans were not used to this type of fight, and that's why the native factor, the native tribes factor was very relevant for the outcome of the war. So in general, the French were winning the French and Indian War up until the main General George Washington appeared in one important battle that I have written the name here, Jumonville Glen in Pennsylvania. This was one of the battles that was won, and And the interesting aspect here is that William Pitt from Britain, commissioned by the British, invested a lot of money to win the, remember the European name, the 7 Years' War in United States. So they invested a huge amount of money, particularly organized by William Pitt, right, to win the war, and they actually won the war because of this huge investment of money and resources for soldiers, etc., etc. And the point is that by investing that amount of money, the British actually went into were not bankrupt, but had really huge financial problems. And that was the reason why, after the French and Indian War, the colonists were heavily taxed because Britain needed to recover the money invested in the war. So these really heavy taxes actually became a factor for the American independence. Okay, so that's why it's important to remember this war. And the French and Indian War is the historical background for this story, for this novel, The Last of the Mohicans. There are a couple of important ideas in this novel to remember, which I will open a space for you to discuss. If you read The Last of the Mohicans, if you read a summary, if you watched the movie, if you heard the story from a classmate, which aspect do you consider to be interesting to share from the novel or from any indirect resource that you may have found connected to The Last of the Mohicans? Okay, then I'm going to keep talking, if you don't mind. Well, three aspects I would like to point out. Although there are more interesting, relevant aspects to the novel, the first one I would say is nature. Nature is very relevant in this novel. Nature, because basically nature provides sort of an imaginary frontier or line between what was considered civilized and what was considered uncivilized or savage. Okay, so nature was omnipresent at the time. Remember that it was important for their actually survive because they depended on farming. So nature was always present in terms of food. Nature also was very important for the war, as I mentioned before while I was describing the way in which they proceeded in terms of fighting with each other. Nature was used, hiding between two trees or behind a rock, or using, I don't know, a hill to hide a group of people. So nature was also was very present in the novel. So that's one aspect to remember. The other aspect to remember was religion, because Copper decided to include a character called David Gamut, which was a religious character, or at least he had some ideas that were or could have been considered Calvinist ideas. You know, Calvinism is connected with predestination, the idea that our life has already been defined by a supreme power. So regardless of what you can do, you are either to go into hell or to heaven, because basically you have a number tattooed in your back, and you're already saved or doomed. So the way that Cooper described this character, or the way that he gave this dialogues to him, it's basically the idea that he either was mocking Calvinism or did not agree with the Calvinist ideas quite well. Okay, and also in the story, it becomes known, I would say, that religion is not welcomed in these natural landscapes. That religion is part of this unwanted civilization, unwanted European civilization, and that even though tribes had, pagan beliefs, the author is not questioning them, but reaffirming that their connection with nature is it could be even more important, because it's a more balanced, harmonious balance between their lifestyles and the territory and the land. Okay, and the other aspect that's also important to remember is the description that the author made of the relationships between characters who belong to different race. Okay, we witness Natibampo's or Hawkeye's relationship between him and Uncas and Chingachgook, who were two natives. Okay, and he actually gets along even better with them than with the white man. Okay, so it's interesting to see this this connection between the main character, the hero, right, Natibampo, and the Mohicans. And also, so this is an interesting concept, the interracial friendship, and also interracial love. If you think about one of the Mohicans and the general's daughter called Cora. Okay, but I would point out, more than the interracial love, the interracial friendship between the main character Natibampo and Uncas and Chingachgook, and how the author values this idea that regardless of race, or not regardless of the race, but you could become more of a friend with someone who is more connected with nature than with someone who is more connected with the European society or the European values. Okay, so there are aspects that are important to remember from my own perception about the Last of the Mohicans. Okay, I don't know if you have questions, comments, any ideas that you might consider interesting to share. Just go ahead. Let me know. Let us know.
I read the introduction and half of the first chapter, and it's too graphic, the way in which the author described the relationship between natives and the nature, as you previously said. And and also describe perfectly the relationship the white people and the natives. Specifically in the introduction, first the author described the context and how white people wanted the domain of the lands of the native people. It's interesting read it and how cruel was white people with natives also.
That's right. That's right. That's right. We can see this the description or the depiction of the relationship with the natives, which is quite graphic, as you mentioned. And in this case, in this sense, we need to remember or remind ourselves that in several historical moments of human history, some races have deemed to be lower, and in this particular case, the Indians were considered savages or that did not have Christian souls. So that idea or those ideas usually justify your strategies to conquer a piece of land and justify the idea of moving the frontier and go west to find more resources. So that's interesting what you mentioned, right? Actually the description that we see from the relationship is also something that will be repeated later on when we deal with the slave narratives, with the treatment that the white men or the white landowners had towards the slaves. So we're going to see again this vision of lower races that sometimes stereotypes our race, but also we need to remember the economic reasons that justify this type of perception, because it's quite convenient for some people to assign a lower value to a minority, because in that way you can take advantage, right? And you can get all the resources. Okay, so that's something that we need to remember. So remember concepts from the. I'm sorry, Natalia was going to say something, or Mauricio?
Me again.
Go ahead, go on.
Also, something that I found interesting is the how slaves and natives join forces to fight against white people. I think that relation between both is interesting in this fight to avoid the to avoid white people take the lands of these native, because slaves feel secure being part of the native people living with them, because in some way slaves feel free living with them.
Yes, that's very very interesting. Particularly tribes or the French would become allies with several tribes, and the tribes were very smart in terms of who they became allies with, because they had their preferences in or they put the coins or the chips on the winning side, right? They most of the tribes, even though they traded before with a specific side. For example, there were tribes that had already economic bonds, or they would trade with the French, and some tribes that would trade with the British before the French and Indian War. When I mean trade, that they would hunt, they would sell probably fur and to the colonies. The tribes that became allies with the French would see them as the possible winners in the conflict. So in the end, they would proceed, to request for some benefits, considering that they would have they would support the winners, and when you support a side, you expect to get some benefits from this decision, right? So that's important to remember, that there were economical bonds between the natives and the colonies, and the empires before the war, but the idea of becoming allies was also reflected upon by the native leaders in terms of what they were going to get from this decision. Okay, that's important to remember, that the native leaders were smart people. They would consider what was the best for their communities. We don't need to think about them as just naive people who were going to buy anything that was sold to them. Now, changing the subject, most of you should have read something about slave narratives, if I'm not mistaken. Please, if at any moment I'm saying something that was not part of a deal, let me know, right? So you were supposed to read a bit about slave narratives. Is that right?
Teacher,
Yes, ma'am?
can I add something to the last conversation?
Sure. Let me go back to the previous slide so we can have it as a background. Go on.
Okay, so I was giving it a thought to the symbols found in the novel, and in connection to nature, there are and also found it on the internet, that the caves represent safety and security for the people, because whenever they leave the caves, their life starting at risky points. And I wanted to say that in connection to nature.
Exactly. And safety was connected with the civilized section of United States at that time. Going westward implied to go to the unknown, to go to uncharted territories, and in places where the rules for civilization did not apply, at least in the heads of the colonists. So the idea presented by the book, in which a white person, Hawkeye, becomes friends with natives, and the natives would also prove to have very steady values, that could become friends, loyal friends. That it's something very relevant and interesting to see from this novel, as the general perception was that natives were savages that could not be trusted. So, and the reason for that is because when you are in your comfort zone, you don't want to leave, because you don't want the unexpected to happen. You want to remain in a safe zone, and that's the idea that comes from the frontier. Up to the frontier is a safe place. If you cross the frontier, You never know what's going to happen to you, because other rules and other values apply. And this frontier kept moving westward. Originally, it was very close to where the first colonies were. But then it kept moving, this line, imaginary line, kept moving westwards, right? Particularly if you are familiar with the Lewis and Clark expedition and the native guide called Sacagawea. Maybe you're familiar with it from the movie Una noche en el museo. I guess
Yes.
that's the, okay.
Yes.
Uh-huh. So the inhabitants in this country knew at the time that they had lots of resources that were not very vast unexplored areas. So and acquiring more territories in the West implied taking away the land from the natives, taking away the land from the original inhabitants of United States, the real locals, the real Americans, right? So yeah, that I agree with the concept expressed by Daniela about safety in the civilized side of the country. I don't know if anyone has any further ideas to share about the last of the Mohicans. All right, then I'm going to move on to the slave narratives. Um, the slave narratives. If you're reading the same slide that I am, it says the big ideas. Historical sources have strengths and weaknesses, and slavery was a dynamic individual experience which differed from person to person as well as from place to place and from time to time. Do you have any comments or questions about these two ideas?
Professor,
Mm-hmm.
about the reading this concerning this idea. In the first point, historical sources says that have a strengths and weaknesses. For example, I remember that when a slave wanted to write his or her memories, it at a certain point in time, it was not very important, their ideas. But instead, if an owner or a master would publish that or write about that, it would be much more significant, much more relevant. So I think maybe that's what in this point is trying to explain, that it has different meanings when certain person tells a story, right?
Yeah, that's something to keep in mind. The fact the authorship has a lot to do with the legitimacy of story. The accounts written by slaves were highly questioned, and particularly considering that most of slaves were illiterate. So the fact of not being able to read or write would provide some sort of right, like a mysterious halo, like if he or she could not read and write, how come there's this autobiographical account of his or her experience as a slave? So who wrote it, right? So that's something to keep in mind. Many slaves could not read and write. Some of them could, and for those who could, even the idea of writing in perfect English, writing poems with perfect metric, was also an idea that was questioned and analyzed by some. Like, how could a slave write in such a perfect English, and even poetry, following some classic examples.
Yeah, and Professor,
Mhm.
another point that I would like to highlight is that when masters write about slavery, they wrote it about what they think slavery was for them, like something beneficial for society, for economy, not taking into account the personal suffering of slaves. And that's, and using these books or stories, novels, the own masters uh, had ideas from those books to justify slavery, right? Instead, when a slave, obviously, in later historical periods, when they had the permission, or they were freed, sometimes escaped from their masters, they started writing about their experiences. And abolitionists used those books, those novels, and those writings in order to justify why slavery should be abolished. So there you have two different points of view in which each of these parts um, justify themselves and support themselves in order to defend their ideas.
Oh, of course. That's something that has always happened, right? People use literary sources to or literary works to defend even personal or going beyond political ideas. Totally agree with that. So exactly, exactly. So slavery was dynamic, was individual. We cannot say every single slave underwent the same experience. And then um we can talk about the type of slave narratives, because each one was unique, but also had a different form. For example, we have narratives, um, accounts by former slaves assisted by amanuensis. I learned this word a couple of days ago. Amanuensis is, I'm going to write the definition, okay, that I have here. A literary or artistic assistant, in particular one who takes dictation or copies manuscripts. So they had these people who were assisting them to write, all written posthumously, meaning after they died, right? Autobiographies is also another type of account for slave narratives, particularly Frederick Douglass's, Harry Jacobs's, which are the ones that we're going to be referring in this course. And another type of slave narratives were the interviews, as we can read here, with former slaves, completed in the 1920s and 1930s by the WPA and other programs. The WPA it stands for Work Projects Administration, um, which is a program that was developed by the which was a program developed and designed by the government at the time to give work to journalists who were unemployed. So they gave this task to them, in which which consisted in them uh, collecting or recording, interviewing slaves to write about their experience as a slave. Okay, so slaves consisted of these audios that were recorded between 1920s and 1930s and that were transcribed by these journalists, the autobiographies, and some other narratives that were written by assistants, right, who helped slaves who could not read or write. And they mainly describe, these slave narratives describe the life of slaves, not only in the United States, but also in Canada and the Caribbean islands. Okay, so in general, slave narratives capture from the kidnapping process to being taken to United States in what is called the Middle Passage that we're going to be discussing later, and even the moments in which they would try to escape, they would try to become fugitives. And those were some of the ideas that were developed in these slave narratives. Now, in the question, in which way slave narratives are connected with abolitionism? Any ideas? Because on the one hand, slave narratives were descriptive of the life or the hardships undergone by the slaves, but on the other hand, you know, some narratives have a different purpose, which is to provoke a change, right? I cannot be always complaining or describing something, but I may want to change the conditions that I'm going through. So in which way you can connect the slave narratives with the ending of slavery or abolitionist ideas? Any comments or ideas on that?
Okay, usually those those narratives were used to move the hearts and to group people under the conviction of everyone being equal, and they could no longer be suffering because they were different to the white American or French people that were living in a different way just because they were there and they had the better weapons just to take the people in and submit them to what they wanted and what they needed them to do.
Exactly. Very well said. Very well put. That's right. You not only you want to be descriptive, but also you want to, as Miguel said, move the hearts of other people, of the audience who's reading this, particularly for the white audience, the ones who could read at that time, in general, if we put it in general words, and particularly the ones in the north, right, in northern states. Because if we have to place slavery, we have to place slavery as an institution in the southern states which were based on farming, who were agricultural societies. So the natives didn't take it well, could not stand being slaves, even though they were indentured slaves in United States. Indentured slaves is a way of having a contract with someone who would go to a specific place to work for you for an amount of years. For example, many people who could not afford to travel to United States, who could not afford to buy a ticket to board a ship, would travel as indentured slaves. So they would go for a period of years, 5 years, 7 years, well, until they finish paying off the ticket and the food and the clothes, you know, that was part of the contract. And after they finished with this indentured slavery, they will become free citizens, right? So that was a way in which people could travel to this new world to get more opportunities, basically opportunities that were not offered to him or her in Europe. So the idea of slave narratives also had the idea of captivating this wide northern audience so that they could fight together for the abolitionist cause. Okay, the first slave narrative that I can recall of was the one written by Olaudah Equiano. That was the first autobiographical slave narrative. And that's something that I want to, take a look at now. Have you read anything about Olaudah Equiano's interesting narrative? I mean, that's the title, Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano. Or Gustavus Vassa, the African. Interesting, right? Olaudah Equiano or Gustavus Vassa. Do you know why he had two names? Or more? Any ideas? Maybe you don't know, but what do you think he... Go. Go on.
I was going to say something, but I believe
Rocio.
someone spoke before me. I don't know.
No. I just say not really that I do not know why he
Okay.
has more than one name.
Rocio, any guessing?
I wrote that some slaves would change their names because they had their original name when they were born, and then when you purchased a slave, you could change their name. Maybe that's why they have two names, and maybe they remained their original name because obviously they were not their master's property anymore.
That's right. One of the privileges that the owners had was to name the slaves with whatever names they wanted to give them. As a property, a slave was an asset. Was I don't want to say the word thing, but it was basically a piece of property that could be bought, could be sold, could be borrowed, could be inherited, could be given as a way of thanks to someone, could be auctioned, and of course, giving a slave a new name was just the least of the changes undergone by a person, right? And exactly two names, Olaudah Equiano or Gustavus Vassa, because Gustavus Vassa was given to him by one of his owners. Usually the names were, of course, easier for the master to pronounce, or just a wimp, something that we'll never know. So exactly two names, because that's the other one was given by a master. What else do you know about Olaudah Equiano's narrative? As I mentioned before, as I can recollect, the first or one of the first accounts on slavery was the one written by Laodiceano. I think he went through two different masters. Slaves, some of them had to travel a lot because they had to move with their masters, right? Some of them had their whole lives in a plantation, right? So cotton picking was one of their main assignments. Some of them were in charge of nurturing or in charge of caring for the family's babies, for instance. So each experience was very unique. Some of them were well treated, and most of them went through very harsh hardships. The slave narratives, if we have to place them in terms of times, some of them are called antebellum, and some of them are called, well, let's focus on the first one first. Antebellum and are the ones that were written before the war, before the Civil War, okay? And post-vellum are the ones that were written after the Civil War, okay? Antebellum and post-vellum. I'm going to write it here in the antebellum, which means, you know, a fancy way to say before the war, and post-vellum. Okay, that's in the chat. Okay. I'm not sure if I'm still sharing the PowerPoint
Yes,
presentation. Am I?
You are no longer. No, you just. Now you are.
Okay, thank you so much, Miguel. Thank you so much. The fact that I'm mentioning this concept, the idea of antebellum and post-vellum narratives, is that in general, slave narratives focus on the bondage in the South, in southern states. Focus on the experience of being a fugitive slave, for instance. Okay. On the conditions in which there was food, physical deprivation, intellectual deprivation, because they were not given time to share with each other. Families were separated. Some members of the family were sold, right? And then post-vellum slave narratives would focus on what we've said before, engaging a more white or northern audience, so that they could become free at some point. Because remember that slavery came later with Abraham Lincoln, right? With the 13th Amendment, right? And that was, of course, passed by Lincoln, but was approved by the Congress. So it's also important to remember that Laodiceano depicted this middle passage that I actually want to go through that idea. Okay. So slavery as an institution existed even in the Bible. We can see that slavery is mentioned, and slavery was present in Africa as well. Some tribes who would conquer other tribes or who would go and raid these tribes would bring would loot, right, and would get some members of the other tribe to become slaves. But slaves who had a different role in the tribes, slaves who were not diminished, or they were not looked down upon, but who were taken to fulfill or to perform certain roles or jobs that were not highly considered by the community. So slavery as an institution was present in Africa. Now, the point is that the empires, Spain, Portugal, Britain, they would pay, right, to some tribes, to some African leaders, to raid and bring people to the coasts in some countries in Africa, so they could get them some, you know, gunpowder or alcohol or any other materials, right? So the idea in this case is that even though slavery existed before in Africa, it was not the same type of slavery that Africans had to go through in the United States. Now, Equiano describes the process from the eyes of a child. So he describes the people in the ship as ghosts. He describes this. Remember that he writes his autobiographical account as an adult, but reflects on his first naive experience as he was watching these horrific creatures, taking them in the ship and are undergoing this very cruel treatment. So Oladipuano becomes an abolitionist later, right? Just like Frederick Douglass, he joins the anti-slave trade movement. So this is the Middle Passage. If you're able to read the Middle Passage, what's the second leg, right? So the first leg was probably from Europe to Africa, right? They would take alcohol, usually rum, like, you know, what we're told that the pirates usually drank at the time, rum. They would take it to gunpowder as well, guns were taken to Africa. And they would give these to these African tribe leaders. They would get slaves in return. And the second leg was the Middle Passage. It's called the Middle Passage because it's the second leg of this triangle. Slaves were taken from Africa to the Caribbean islands, to South America, to North America, particularly United States at that time. And the third leg was going back to Europe with the natural resources that they would need it, right? Cotton, sugar, tobacco, etc., etc. So that was a triangle. And the second part was the Middle Passage. The numbers vary in terms of how many Africans were transported against their will to North America, Central America, and South America. But some say there were like 12 million of Africans. that was transported in this triangle trade between Europe, Africa, and what was called at that time the Americas. Some of them were transported to the south, as I said before, to Brazil. That's why we see a huge number of black people in Brazil, the Caribbean area, and in North America. Questions, comments? So we need to remember that slavery was highly beneficial for the economy of the United States, particularly for southern states, and became an issue that shaped the political life of the United States, because in the end, after the Middle Passage, after slavery was abolished, after slavery was abolished, the African Americans became second-class citizens. I mean, they could not fully achieve the status of a first-class citizen, and so it's important to remember that the American economy at the time flourished because of the arrival of the African slaves. Sad but true. And and Olalequeno reflects on this passage, which is a very it's a very sad and it's a very complex moment in history for African people. Whenever you have a tragic moment in history for a community or for a group of people, for a nation, that leaves an important mark in their lives. Consider that some of the current American citizens had relatives who were slaves and are currently living in the same state with relatives of another white family who owned slaves. So slavery as a social marker is still present in many societies, particularly in the American society or the society in the United States. Okay, that's why it's very important that we take a moment to reflect on this. The Middle Passage, in which some people say 12 million, some say more. It's a whole country, actually. It's a whole country. The travel took 2 months, 4 months, up to 6 months, depending on the weather conditions. The voyage had very low conditions, low quality conditions. There were no seats. They were, as you can see in the picture, slaves were laying on the deck. There were two ideas, two concepts of how transporting cargo at that time, because slaves were considered a cargo, were considered a property that should be transported from one place to the other. They didn't have any notions of human rights, or they were not considered to have human souls. Therefore, they were just considered like boxes that had to be taken from one place to the other in a ship. So one conception was to have, or to quotation, I'm quoting here, to pack as many slaves as possible in a ship. So in the end, if you take 300 of slaves in a ship, even though many of them die because of the horrible conditions, at least you're going to get a fair number to be traded with in the markets or in the auctions. Okay, so that's what was called a tight pack. And the loose pack was another conception in which a ship would take very few slaves to provide them with better conditions, so that all of them could reach the destination, and none of them could die from disease or not being fed properly. Okay, so I would say that in terms of the Middle Passage, if a slave was taking with the conception of a tight pack, he would have very, very hard conditions in the ship, such as lying next to each other, not having time to walk around, being fed with only very few rations of food, and being most of the time chained to the ship. So that's what we learn from several of the slave narratives, and specifically from Olariqueno's narrative, which describes the Middle Passage. Okay, the conditions, I insist, were unsupportable. Being chained, not having a bathroom but only a bucket, being sick because they had to spend months at sea. If someone got sick or was seasick, did not have any proper attention. So at some point, some of the slaves would commit suicide if they were given the chance to escape. There were many. Think about the worst conditions. Think about the worst. Sometimes this situation brought upon the slaves the having a complete power over another one gave the captain or the sailors, right, the possibility to do whatever they want with slaves, particularly with female slaves. Going back to slave narratives in general, and going back to this idea, narratives, to recap, were written by assistants, right, or written posthumously, which is after the slaves was dead. Okay. Now, since we are considering how, and remember that slave narratives as a narrative, as a literary work, we need to consider it from a very critical point of view, considering how reliable they are, how reliable memories are from 10, 50, 70 years ago, 100 years ago. And this recollection of different facts and events, how reliable are these slave narratives, particularly considering the following. Some of them were written by assistants who wrote them after the African American was dead. Okay, how can we trust that some facts or events were not added, that were not actually authorized by the person who gave the account. For the autobiographies, how can we tell that some events were actually true or not created in order to provoke or cause more sympathy in an audience so that they can join the abolitionist cause? And in connection with the interviews, some of the interviews were carried out by white journalists. My point is, how reliable are interviews that were transcribed by white journalists, considering on the one hand that they could have former landowners or slave owners relatives, or two, if you had been interviewed by someone, you can realize that it's not the same if someone with the same gender interviews you, someone from the same socioeconomic status, someone with the same political views or not, someone older or younger than you interviews you. So depending on different characteristics of the interviewer, sometimes the interview might be valid or not. It might be forced or it might flow naturally. Okay, so that's something that we need to consider. I'm not saying, and I want you to pay attention to this. I'm not saying that slave narratives are a bunch of lies. I'm saying every time we read, discuss, or analyze a narrative or any piece of writing, we need to do it from a critical perspective. Okay? Could the relationship between the interviewer and the interview make any difference in the content of the interview? That's where I was referring to in terms of the status of the interviewer and the interviewee, the race, the gender. Okay, that's something to remember. What might happen to a story between its telling and its recording months, years, or decades later? Some of the interviews that were recorded as part of this process in the 1920s and 30s were recollection of events that took place long time ago. How reliable is memory whenever you are retelling a story? How reliable is the person who's taking notes? Okay, so that's something with the interpretation, like what do you know and how do you feel about people who has been slaved? Okay, so these are interesting aspects that we need to consider whenever we read about slave narratives, and whenever we have to interpret information that is a historical account. For example, let me show you this. I managed to purchase a spelling book and set about teaching myself to read as best as I could. Every spare moment I could find was devoted to that employment, and when about my work I could catch now and then a stolen glance at my book just to refresh my memory with the simple lesson I was trying to learn. It finally reached the ear of the masters that I was learning to read, and then, if he saw me with a book or a paper in my hand, oh, how he would swear at me, sending me off in a hurry about some employment. Still I persevered, but was more careful about being seen making any attempt to learn to read. At last, however, I was discovered, and I had to pay the penalty of my determination. This excerpt on an interview by Austin Stewart. So what are the aspects that we can learn from this excerpt on the interview about the experience of one person in slavery? I can show you another one, maybe. Oh, here's the ending. I had been set to work in the sugar bush, and I took my spelling book with me. When a spare moment occurred, I sat down to study, and so absorbed was I in the attempt to blunder through my lesson that I did not hear the captain's son-in-law coming until he was fairly upon me. He sprang forward, caught my poor spelling book, and threw it into the fire, where it was burnt to ashes, and then came my turn. He gave me first a severe flogging, and then swore if he ever caught me with another book, he would whip every inch of skin off my back. This treatment, however, instead of giving me the least idea of giving it up, only made me look upon it as a more valuable attainment. 22 years a slave and 40 years a freeman. Any comments or questions?
With this, we can learn how a little of a human being with uh, features such as curiosity and the ability to learn, they were considered, because they were thought to be just these machines used to work in the sugarcane farms or anything. And if they showed a little bit of rebellious or human behavior, they will be taken away, and they will take away the very little thing they were cherishing the most, such as this book that he was using to learn something as simple as and vain as we see today, as it is reading. So if they showed anything, any trait of being human, they will be taken down from that cloud they were dreaming on.
Exactly. And beyond enjoyment, beyond the pleasure of reading a book, anything else that you see there in the idea of taking away a small book from a slave?
Yes, I can notice that these type of novels are too graphic in the way they are written. Probably the idea is, as you said before, is to contribute to the abolition of the cause, which is slavery, because some of white people never imagine how difficult is the life of a slave, working every day, being punished every day, even for their curiosity.
Exactly, that's right. That's right. And with education, with literacy, comes the possibility of reading someone else's ideas, right? And if you learned about someone else's ideas, you may want to join that cause. So the more slaves that could read and write, the more people that could be informed about the abolitionist cause, and the more people that would join. So it was highly convenient for slave masters to keep them ignorant, to keep them illiterate, right? So that's something that we need to consider. Not only the taking any pleasure from slaves, but also that once they became literate, they were closer to becoming dangerous for the slavery as an institution, right? Let me
Probably is
yeah.
sorry. Probably I was thinking in the uh, in this relationship with because nowadays uh, I'm trying to establish a relationship between the nowadays government, because the more we know uh, is dangerous for all those people, because we are more in the amount of people that can fight against the government to fight for our interest. Maybe is related with the this nowadays context, trying to fight for our rights, probably.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. They say ignorance is a bliss. I don't think it applies
Yes.
here, but I would say keeping someone ignorant is not giving him or her his own rights exactly,
Hmm.
and also um, giving slaves the possibility to read would open a door towards reading the Bible. And since society at this time was highly religious in general terms, it would give them a weapon to defend themselves from a more biblical perspective on the one hand. On the other hand, whenever, for example, there was a slave who ran away, which were called fugitive slaves at that time, they would post signs, right? In this sign, you could see a description of a slave. So, giving the slaves the chance to read would also give them the chance to become more informed about the threats to their own lives that were posted, right, in signs. So that's something to remember. I'm going to show you
In
another.
that, sorry, I
Go
want to
go.
share. In that sense, I was thinking with the history of Phyllis Wheatley. Obviously, she also was a slave.
Hmm.
Very lucky, because took the obviously the name of their family, and she found a shelter on God in the religious. And sometimes it's difficult to determine if she thinks to being a slave because found God, and probably is the same connection with this type of narrative.
Right, right. Her experience was I wouldn't say privileged, but
Uh-huh.
if we compare her experience with someone else's that was a slave, uh, the family that took her in was a family that taught her to read and write, because they knew that she was going to be teaching or having a closer relationship with their children. And I would say that they had a more Christian perspective on the way to treat other people.
Yes.
So it is complex to judge Phyllis Whitley in terms of, you know, could have she done something more? She knew how to read and write, so maybe advocate more for freedom, advocate more for abolitionism. Uh, but it's complex to say, because you have to be wearing, the other person's shoes to understand their situation. Um, there's another excerpt here of an interview. The person interviews Lucia Adams. She says, "Lord, you better not be caught with a book in your hand. If you did, you were sold. They didn't load that. I can read a little, but I can't write. I went to school after slavery and learned to read. Again, right? The idea of literacy, the idea of learning to read as someone that was either despised, frowned upon, or was punished, right, by the owners, because education becomes a weapon in the hand of people, right? Um, it's very interesting to see these excerpts because they relate the idea that many of them persisted in trying to read and write. Many of them, despite of the punishment, wanted so badly to read. The same thing with, for example, Frederick Douglass, which is one author, including the syllabus. Frederick Douglass was also a slave who could not read and could not write, but forced himself to become literate, and then he became an abolitionist, an advocate for freedom, and he became a highly prominent writer, and someone who wrote very powerful speeches. So someone who had who was very skillful with the words and with the power of rhetoric. So as you can see, it's interesting the process of some of slaves. I mean, some of the people who were slaves at some point in their lives, but they became free and became advocates of the cause of independence, of the cause of abolitionism.
Professor,
Yes.
I just wanted to like add a comment on what you're saying. Is
Mhm.
that, for example, I think that what I get from these excerpts is basically the idea of education, like as a vehicle for liberation, let's say,
Mhm.
like because, for example, nowadays, education still represents that because there are
Mhm.
still many communities and people who do not get the opportunity to have education. But in this context, it's in the context of extreme oppression and incarceration. So I believe that their necessity or their resilience and to continue learning stems from the extreme necessity to do it, because that means that they can understand more of the world that's around them and be more involved in it, so that they don't continue to have this passive role against the oppression. So I think that's what I get, like education as a vehicle for liberation.
What wonderful and well said, Mauricio. We can make a connection with Freire's concept of education on the power of liberating the people, liberating their potential, right? So education becomes a transformative force, right, to free people from chains. In this case, the chains imposed by an institution that was economically based, right? Slavery was economically based, but they had justifications on very weak arguments, such as slaves did not have souls, or slaves are a lower race. Um, if you consider the British view on society, the British view as an empire, right? The British view on society was highly organized, and it would place people and things in a ranking of importance. So they would place the white the white people at the top of this pyramid, right? The white people, particularly the landowners, and particularly the male, at the top of this pyramid, and then below, in the rest of the pyramid, they would place the rest of the things and people, and particularly people at the colonies, specifically natives, and more specifically slaves, were at the bottom of this pyramid. So it's a very interesting connection that Mauricio is making, and we can relate to Paulo Freire's education concept in the sense of liberating the potential of the people. That's right. Now, we have been going to the center and to the outer part of a circle. We have been talking about slave narratives, going to specific examples like these excerpts in education, or some aspects of Oladipuano's biographical account. Now, what do we learn by reading Oladipuano? Because each experience is unique. So when we deal with Oladipuano's account, when we deal with Harry Jacobs's account or Frederick Douglass's account, from each we learn something different. Okay, so what do we learn by reading Oladipuano's interesting narrative? What's his perspective on slavery, or what's relevant from his experience as both as a literary work and also as a personal experience? I'm trying to recap, but I'm also trying to see if you can contribute to the comprehension of Oladipuano's interesting narrative. Maybe you learned or you read the excerpt that was in the LMS, the one related to Harriet Jacobs's experience. Maybe you want to discuss that one.
Professor?
Yes, ma'am.
Maybe for what I could learn about this is that the subject of education was a really delicate subject, and within this slaved society, and the fact that education could be an option for slaves, it was a threat for masters and for the society and the economy that they were handling at that time. And I think that with these narratives, these slaves could portray the actual reality towards society, and especially towards slaves, for them to rise and free themselves from this injustice and tyranny they have been living for years. So I think education plays a main role within this time in history.
Thank you. Anybody else would like to join the conversation?
Teacher.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I was thinking, well, maybe it is not that connected with the North American history, but I think that at the beginning of our own independence, we went through something similar, and they weren't slaves as the slaves that were brought from Africa. I mean, the African Americans,
Mm-hmm.
but they belong. The land belonged to the ethnic groups of Chile, and then they were stolen from them, and when all this process of mixing cultures started, and we decided to be independent. I think it's the same. I mean, um, it was economical in certain moment, and that caused the rebellion. Um, and I mean, I think everything is connected because we received these ideas from others, but also because um, at the moment we are educated in certain way. We started to have our own ideas, and liberty is one of the things that we are always pursuing.
Right. Right. Anybody would like to agree, disagree, express his own or her own opinion about what was just mentioned?
Um, well, I totally agree with what Rocio said
Mm-hmm.
about the education, because I was thinking about what if the slaves were educated, and maybe the masters in that time, um, I don't know if they were going they would be put it as like aside, because of the experience that the slaves people had in that moment, so they can write, they could write more, I like stories or biographies, because of all the experiences that they has had to pass. I don't know. I was just thinking.
Right, right. No, 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 no. Go ahead. It's good to make these reflections and to ponder about the and share basically, because your idea, your thought may connect with someone else's, or may be an inspiration that might trigger other ideas. So always thoughts and reflections are welcomed. um, Two things. Because I'm taking a look at the time and it's 10, almost 10:30. Two things. One is the big question: what do we learn by reading Equiano's, Harriet's, sorry, Jacobs, and Douglas? What do we learn from reading each of their slave narratives? Okay, what's the insight that we gained by reading each one of them, considering that each experience was unique, considering that each one of them focused on a specific experience or experiences that they underwent, considering that Oladipuano was born in Africa and came as a child to United States, considering that Harry Jacobs was female, right? And therefore, her perspective must have been different from the perspective of two male slaves. And consider that Frederick Douglass also was illiterate, but then he became a very sophisticated orator and spokesperson for the abolitionist cause. So see specifically what's new about each slave narrative. Okay, what's new? And the other thing is I'm looking at the syllabus now that I would like to share with you, and I'm seeing that in the Romantic period, in which we have the first presentations, we have the Black Cat, Telltale Heart, Scarlet Letter, Cask of Amontillado, the Raven, and Moby Dick, right? And we don't know an order. We don't know an order. So I'm going to share with you this website. Can you see the website? Can you see a wheel here? Can you see the wheel?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, in the wheel, you have the names for the Romantic period. You see the Black Cat, Moby Dick, Raven, Cask of Amontillado, Scarlet Letter, and the Telltale Heart, okay? So now we're going to define the order at random, okay? So here we go. The first presentation will be Scarlet Letter. The second presentation would be the Black Cat. Hopefully we don't repeat them. The next one will be Moby Dick. Next one, Cask of Amontillado. Moby Dick is already in third place. Scarlet Letter is already the first place. And the last one, Telltale Heart. What are we missing? We're missing 3, 4, 5, 6. We're missing just one, which is, can you see it?
I
The
think
Raven.
there are only 6.
Okay, only the Raven. So the Raven will be number 6. Okay, so the first presentation will be the Scarlet Letter. The second one, the Black Cat. The third one, Moby Dick. Number 4, the Cask of Amontillado. Number 5, the Telltale Heart. And number 6, the Raven. Okay, if you want to change the order, I'm totally fine with that, but you need to contact the students. Okay, I don't have the list here of students. I mean, I do have it, but let's see. 5. Okay. So the Scarlet Letter, María Paz Alarcón and Nicole Gallardo. That will be the first presentation. The Black Cat, Laura, Belén, Miguel, Carlos, and Romina. The second presentation. Moby Dick, number 3, Mauricio, Catalina, and Martín. The Cask of Amontillado, number 4, will be, it's not here, Natalia and Alejandro.
Also Carlos Eduardo.
Natalia, Alejandro, Carlos Eduardo. Thank you.
Yes. Professor,
Yeah.
we probably going to change our Tale of Poe for another one, but we are deciding which tale yet.
Good. Let me know when you're ready. Okay.
Okay.
Number 5, the Telltale Heart, Javiera Peredo and Constanza. And the last presentation for the romantic period will be The Raven by Camila Conejo and Diana Contreras. Okay? The presentations are going to start as soon as we finish with the current topic. If we take a look at the syllabus, we're going to be finishing with the slave narratives, right? We're going to be discussing this the following week, the three slave narratives. So yeah, on we have classes the next session is on Friday. So we're going to be discussing this on Friday. So probably you need to.
Professor,
This Friday is.
this Friday we don't have classes.
You're so right.
May the 1st.
Yeah, you're so right. I'm so wrong. So next time we meet is going to be on Wednesday. So on Wednesday we're going to be finishing with the slave narratives, hopefully. Maybe one activity on Friday. So we may start with the presentations on Friday. The 8th, or on Wednesday the 13th. Okay.
Professor?
I'm listening.
That week is the assessment week or not? The 11th?
I think so. I think so. I'm not so sure, to be honest, in terms of the assessment week. I'm particularly. I would say that we have evaluations that could not necessarily be placed in the assessment week, because the online forum is a permanent during the semester, and it's asynchronic. You have a week, right, more or less, to post and reply. The book reports have specific dates that may not match the assessment week, either the first one or the second one. The global interview, I would say that's the only one. The global interview would be the only one that would fit or match specifically with the second assessment week. But the other evaluation, which is the literary product and the essay, are not part of any assessment week. So in terms of the this course, we are not having, as far as I know, an evaluation during the first assessment week, but a book report. Okay, so and I don't think that we're going to stop the classes. I'm not sure about that part, because I was told to handle the evaluations in this course in classes, and not specifically stopping classes to have an assessment week. Okay, so that's something that I need to confirm.
Okay, that was like my doubt, because as we usually stop classes during the assessment week.
Yeah, I know. I will get back to you on this one, because I was told. Actually, today I have a school meeting, a meeting with the rest of the faculty. So that's going to be one of my questions, because as far as I knew, each teacher within the team, meaning, for example, in my case, Mrs. Canelos and me, should agree on the way we're going to proceed. Okay, and each team, group of teachers for every specific course should decide on how they're going to evaluate the students, obviously with an agreement with the students participating in that specific course. So I'll get back to you very soon, because I'm having a meeting in the afternoon with the rest of the colleagues.
Okay, thank you.
Alrighty, sure. Barbara, I got you here. We're replacing Lolita by the Grapes of Wrath. Excellent. Thank you so much. Daniela, I don't know. Let me know where and how and what.
Professor, is that me and Daniela chose
Yeah.
Huckleberry Finn, and I don't know if we have to present now, because I believe that that book was for another period, historical period.
Well, no, we're going to concentrate, or we're going to focus on only the works which are considered to be part of the Romantic period. Yeah, we're not going to skip literary periods. Okay, so so in the case of Barbara is the Grapes of Wrath, and and in the case of Rocio and Daniela, were you here in the list before? Yes, Rocio and Daniela. I catch you here with Huckleberry, and do you have the other option already?
Yes, we chose a book which is called Their Eyes Were Watching God. From Zora Neale Hurston.
You said Mia Preston or no? Okay, can you write it in the chat, please?
Yes, it's better.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, guys. Do you have any comments or questions, suggestions, anything before we finish?
Professor,
Mm-hmm.
so when do we start the presentations on the book reports? Like a date?
I was considering that, okay, we're not meeting this Friday, and next Wednesday we should give Slate Narratives a closure. I mean, there's still discussion to be done, particularly on Harry Jacobs's and Frederick Douglass's. So I think that's going to happen on Wednesday, the 6th, May the 6th. So we have two options. We can start presentations on the 8th, on Friday the 8th, and there's only a chance for one presentation to go there, okay? Or on Wednesday the 13th, to have two presentations of that day. Okay, so my suggestion would be to be ready for your presentation on May the 8th. But I think it's a better idea to start with the Romantic period on May the 13th, which is a Wednesday. Okay, so
yes, I agree, actually.
okay, so the initial date to officially start with a Romantic period, it's going to be on May the 13th. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
Alrighty.
Professor?
Yeah, I'm listening.
Professor, in terms of time, how long these presentations are going to be? 15 minutes, 10 minutes?
These presentations are expected to cover to be a very deep cover, or not a cover, a study on each specific topic. So the idea is that For example, in your case, Natalia, you're working with Alejandro and Carla.
Yes.
Okay, so each one of you, because you're a group of 3, will have to divide aspects connected with narrator, setting, symbolism and themes, characters, biographical aspects of Edgar Allan Poe, right, and Theodore Dwight in Carey, social context. So there are many aspects that I wouldn't say that would go for less than a 20-minute presentation.
Okay.
Okay. I would if I roll the dice, I would say, I guess between a 20 to 25-minute presentation. After the presentation, we're going to have a round of questions in which all of the members, all of the participants in the session, including the teacher, will ask questions about, aspects that were not mentioned or clear, or reflections on what you mentioned before. Not necessarily questions, okay? So, so in the end, I'm considering another 20 to 25 minutes. So basically, a presentation along with the round of questions should end at minute 45, 50. Then, then if we're having a 2-hour class, a short break, and after that, the following presentation.
Okay, Professor, thank you.
Alrighty. Questions before we leave?
I have another question.
Sure.
Professor, I sent you an email. I don't know if you read it.
Maybe. So what's the email about?
The forums on the LMS, the deadlines.
Yes, I read it, and I need to go on that deadlines for forums. Yes, I read it. I think it was a very relevant question, because forums, a forum question will not be there for the whole semester, right? So yeah, I'll go on that, and I'm going to give a deadline for this.
Okay, yeah, that's my concern.
Inform all of that, right?
Say what?
The LMS, the deadline for the forums and all of that through the LMS or for message, right?
Yes. All the deadlines will be in the LMS.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure. Anything else? Okay, then have a good rest of the week. I will see you on Wednesday. Okay, enjoy the week. Enjoy the weekend.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor.
Sure.
Nice. Bye.
You too.
Bye.
Goodbye, everyone.